Assalamu alaikum students. As you all know that up till now we have been studying this chapter Introduction to Biology, and we have covered different lessons including divisions and branches of biology, interdisciplinary science, careers in biology, Quran in biology, Muslim scientists, and levels of organization. We started with a very basic definition of biology, and we discussed the different branches of biology, and then we discussed the different interdisciplinary science and how biology is linked to other subjects. Um, we shared the information regarding the careers in biology, and you shared your opinions regarding the careers you want to opt in future. We also shared the information regarding Quran in biology, then the Muslim scientist, what were the efforts and contribution of the Muslim scientist, and we discussed this topic levels of organization in detail, in which we studied that how the different levels are basically responsible for making an organism. So today the topic which we have to start is cellular organization. So let's see what is cellular organization. The components that make up the cell and how they are arranged inside it. Now, the question arises that what are these components? We have discussed that in levels of organization, that each component called an organelle performs a specific function that is vital for the cell. And you know that what these organelles are, the different biomolecules, they assemble themselves and organize themselves in a particular way, and they form organelle. We discussed about the two types of the organelles. One was the ribosomes, they were responsible for the protein synthesis, and the others were the mitochondria, and they were responsible for the cellular respiration. Now on your screen, you can see the picture of an elephant, the fungi, mushrooms, and different other organisms. So let's see. Basically, the scientists have divided all the organisms into 5 major groups. So what are those 5 major groups? Prokaryotes, Monera, protists, fungi, plants, and animals. Basically, the scientists classify all the organisms into these particular groups so that these organisms can be studied easily, their characteristics can be observed in an easier manner. So that is why they have divided all the organisms of this planet Earth into these categories. And we have also studied about taxonomy, and we know that the scientists classify all the organisms into different groups and subgroups so that they can be easily studied and observed. As you all know that all organisms are made up of cells. So today we are going to study that on the basis of these cells, what categories of the organisms are there. Basically, the organisms are divided into prokaryotes as well as the eukaryotes. The prokaryotes are the organisms which do not have a proper nucleus, and they are unicellular, and all the moneras are basically included in the prokaryotic group. The bacteria are included in this group, whereas the other group is the eukaryotes. The eukaryotes are further divided into unicellular organisms and the multicellular organisms. The unicellular organisms include the protista. Basically, we are going to discuss in detail the prokaryotes and eukaryotes in our chapter number 4, that is related to cell biology. Then the multicellular organisms are divided into the organisms which are without cell wall and the organisms which have the cell wall. The organisms which do not have a cell wall, they are known as animals. They are included in the group Animalia, like dolphins, kangaroos, human beings. Their cells do not have a cell wall. So they are categorized into a different category. Although they are multicellular, but they are still categorized into a different category. Then we have the organisms which do not have a cell wall. So the scientists have divided them into 2 groups, and those 2 groups are, number one is that those who are not able to perform the process of photosynthesis, whereas on the other hand, the ones which perform the process of photosynthesis. So Fungi are basically the organisms which do not carry out the process of photosynthesis, and they are dependent on other organisms. They are heterotrophs and they do not prepare their own food. Whereas the plants basically are responsible for making food. They convert the sunlight energy into the chemical energy, they perform the process of photosynthesis, and in this way they prepare the food not only for themselves but also for all the other organisms on this planet Earth. So this is basically the categorization of the organisms on the basis of the cells, that either they can be prokaryotes or they can be eukaryotes. How do their cell look like? So this is the categorization on the basis of the shape of the cell or the differences at the cell level. Now you can see on your screen that we have two types of the cell as we discussed in the previous slide, eukaryotes and the prokaryotes. You can see that the eukaryotes have a proper nucleus, whereas a prokaryote do not have a proper nucleus. The DNA material or the nuclear material is scattered within the cytoplasm. The other picture on your screen also clearly explains that a prokaryote does not have a proper nucleus. There is just a single loop of DNA, and DNA is a chemical molecule that contains the hereditary material. Whereas the eukaryotes, they have a proper nucleus, and the DNA is basically non-looped chromosome. Now this picture on the right side of the screen shows the difference between a prokaryotic cell and eukaryotic cell. Basically, both are the type of the cell, but due to some differences in the basic type of the cell, as I have discussed, that a prokaryotes do not have a proper nucleus. Their nucleus is not bounded by a membrane, whereas a eukaryotic cell have a proper nucleus. They have membrane bounded structures. Right? So these are the eukaryotic and the prokaryotic cells. So this diagram is basically representing that how a prokaryotic cell differs from a eukaryotic cell. Basically, the topic is of cellular organization, so it was important to understand that how on the basis of the cell, the organisms are categorized into two different categories. Cells organize in three ways to make the bodies of the organisms. As we have seen that organisms are divided into two categories. The prokaryotic cells do not have a proper nucleus, whereas the eukaryotic cells, which have a proper nucleus, including all the animal and the plant cells. But we will see that how the cells organize themselves. Basically, the cells organize in three different ways to make the bodies of the organisms. And those are the unicellular organisms, the multicellular organisms, and the colonial organisms. These words are quite self-explanatory, and they're explaining that what kind of organisms do they include. So on the right side of your screen, you can see the picture of the unicellular organism. Then we have these multicellular organisms. Basically, in chapter Introduction to Biology, we have discussed the levels of organization, and we have seen that how a cell organizes itself into tissues, then tissues form the organ, then organ form the organ system, and the organ system forms a whole organism. That organism can be a human being, it can be a kangaroo, it can be a dolphin, it can be a penguin. So all these organisms are multicellular organisms which follow this pattern from cell to tissue level to the organism level. So they are known as the multicellular organisms. Then we have another category, and that is the colonial organism. We will discuss the colonial organism today along with the unicellular and the multicellular organisms. You are familiar with the unicellular and multicellular organisms. Along with that, there is another information that is related to the colonial organism. So starting with the very first group of organisms, that is the unicellular organism. As the word indicates that uni means one. So let's see what these unicellular organisms are. Only one cell makes the life of an organism. All the life activities are carried out by only cell. Students, just recall your previous knowledge of the information which you had that all the organisms on this planet Earth carry out 7 life processes, including excretion, reproduction, movement, sensitivity. So these are some of the life processes which are carried out by any organism on this planet Earth. They can be unicellular, they can be multicellular or colonial. So if an organism is unicellular, it means that all those 7 life processes, they are going to happen inside them. So either their excretion, their reproduction, or their movement or sensitivity. So we have these organisms. You are going to see the picture of these organisms, that how these organisms look like. One of the example is of paramecium. Then we have this amoeba and euglena. Now let's see how do they look like. This is how an amoeba looks like. It is a jelly-like organism. Its habitat is aquatic ecosystem. It lives in the pond and such kind of environment. Then we have these parameciums. You can see that these are slipper-shaped organisms. They can only be seen under the microscope. You cannot see them with the naked eye. You will always require a microscope in order to observe them. Basically, these are microorganisms. And in the very first lesson, we discussed one of the branches of biology, and that was microbiology. So all the organisms, like these unicellular organisms, they are studied under the heading of microbiology. I'm going to mention over here, as I mentioned previously, that there is a department known as microbiology at different universities of our country, and they teach these subjects, including all the microorganisms. And their habitat is aquatic medium. Over here, I would like to mention one thing. That is why it is always advised to boil your water, because you never know that these kinds of microorganisms might be the part of the water which you are drinking. So it is always advised to boil your water before drinking, because you can see that these are the microorganisms which are living in the aquatic habitat. So they are the part of the water. Their habitat is water. They live in water. So it is now your duty to boil the water before drinking, because there are certain diseases associated with these kinds of the unicellular organisms, which you're going to study in higher classes. Now moving on to another category or the group of organism, and that is colonial organisms. Now let's see what these colonial organisms are. Many unicellular organisms live together but do not have any division of labor among them. Now, basically, the colonial organisms are those kind of organisms which are unicellular, but they were not behaving in the same way as the unicellular organisms do. Because unicellular organisms, only one cell make up the life of the organism, and it performs all the life activities. But over here, these unicellular organisms were living together, but still they were not having any division of labor among them. So scientists categorized into a category known as the colonial organisms. Each unicellular organism in the colony lives its own life, means all the life processes, they perform them individually, and they are not dependent on the other cells for its vital requirement. One of the very best example of the colonial organism on which the scientists are doing a lot of research, and they are observing these microorganisms in order to understand that how do these colonial organisms behave, is the volvox. Volvox is basically a green alga. We discussed in the previous slides about one of the categories that was protists, and they were unicellular. So these green algas, they are protists, and one of the best example is of volvox. And it is found in water, means aquatic habitat. Then they show the colonial organization. Hundreds of volvox cells make up a colony, and this is the picture on the right side of your screen, and it shows that how these volvox move around inside the aquatic medium, and they live in this globular structure, and inside one parent colony you can see several small balls. These are basically the daughter colonies of the volvox. So the parent colony along with the daughter colony, these colonies live together inside the aquatic medium. This diagram is basically representing that how a single volvox cell lives along with the other cell. They are basically covered with this kind of mucilaginous sheath around them. So, and you can also see these kinds of flagellas moving out of them. So these are the single-celled organism, but they are living in the form of a group or a colony, and you will not find any kind of division of labor among them. Now, this third category after the unicellular organisms and the multicellular organism is the multicellular organism. after the colonial organisms. So as the word is indicating, multi means many, so it means that many cells are forming the organism. One of the best example of multicellular organisms are the human beings. On the screen, you can see these yellow fields of the mustard plant. Many of you must have visited some of our areas of Punjab, where you must have observed these yellow fields, and these are of the mustard plant. So these are multicellular organisms. Similarly, on right side of your screen, you can see a frog. So this is also a multicellular organism, having all the cells specialized into tissues and tissues specialized into organs, organ system, and then whole organism like a frog is formed. So, according to a proper way to define that, cells are organized in the form of tissues, organs, and organ system. So, over here you will find that the cells are very much organized. In case of unicellular, there was a single cell. In colonial, there were many cells, but they were not specialized or they were not organized in a proper way. They were just living in the form of a colony, but there was no specialization of a cell into a tissue or organ system level. But in multicellular organism, you will find that an organism has specialization of the tissues. The tissues are categorizing into organs, and organs are categorizing into organ system. For example, a simple tissue, muscle tissue, may form an organ like stomach. An organ may be a part of an organ system. For example, stomach may be a part of a digestive system. Okay, this is the mustard plant, also known as Brassica campestris. We are going to discuss that how the different organisms are given the scientific names. And it is very important to name the organisms. We are going to discuss that why naming is important and why the different organisms are given the scientific names in our chapter that is related to biodiversity. So over here on your screen, you can see that the mustard plant is known as Brassica campestris. Whereas the frog, this kind of species of the frog, there are a variety of species of the frog on this planet Earth, but one of the species is Rana tigrina. Okay, students, as we have discussed the three categories of the organisms on the basis of the cells arrangement, either unicellular, colonial, or multicellular. On the right side of your screen, you can see again the euglena we discussed earlier, that it was a unicellular organism performing all the life activities like movement, excretion on its own. Then we had this volvox, which was a colonial organism, and scientists are still working on these kinds of colonial organisms because they are neither behaving like a unicellular organism nor they are behaving like a multicellular organism. And the third category are the multicellular organisms, in which you will find a proper specialization of cells into other levels of organization. For example, it can be a honeybee, a human being, or the different plants around you. It can be a mango tree, a strawberry plant. So these all are the multicellular organisms. Now, let's consider and focus on some of the details so that you can differentiate between all these three categories. So starting with the unicellular organisms, basically you're going to check that on the basis of the number of cells, how they are categorized. We have been observing that the cell was not specializing into certain levels. That is why it was categorized into these three categories. Now for your memorization, and note down these points on your notebook, that unicellular organisms are composed of only one cell, which will carry out all the life activities of a cell. Then we have the colonial organisms, the group of cells that lack specialization and do not have division of labor among cells. So colonial organisms are the organisms which do not have any division of labor among them. So volvox is one of the examples which we have studied, that they are a group of cells, but they lack specialization. You will not find the cells specializing into the tissue level and other levels of organization. And you will also not find any division of labor among them. As you have seen in the previous slide, that the organisms, they were in the groups, but they were not interacting with each other, and there was no division of labor among them. The last one is the multicellular organisms. They are composed of many specialized cells. For example, the best example is the human being. And we also discussed one of the example of the plant, that was the mustard plant, and frog. So I hope this slide is clear to you that on the basis of the number of cells, organisms are either unicellular, they are colonial, or they may be multicellular. And we are going to discuss the importance of taxonomy in our chapter that is related to biodiversity, that why taxonomy is important, why it is important to organize the organisms into groups and subgroups. Now you can find the importance that yes, it is important to classify the organisms into groups and subgroups, because in this way you can study them easily. For example, all the unicellular organisms which are having these characteristics of a single cell and performing their all life activities can be studied under the heading unicellular, and their characteristics can be observed easily. Similarly, colonial organisms can be categorized into these categories. So categorization is very important, classification is very important. Similarly, the way you classify or you arrange your cupboard so that you can easily find the things, you can find your books or clothes. So you do classification at your home as well. Similarly, the scientists do these kinds of classification in order to make the things easier for the scientists as well as for the students who are learning all these organisms. Okay, students, as you know that we have discussed the multicellular organisms, so one of the best example of multicellular organisms along with the human being is the mustard plant from the group plants. So the scientific name is Brassica campestris. Let's just check out some of the characteristics of these mustard plants and recall your information that in careers of biology we discussed that Pakistan is an agricultural country. So you can also opt for one of the subjects and you can benefit our agricultural industry. And there is a famous university at Faisalabad, um, from where you can get the degree for agriculture. So these mustard plants, basically they are sown in winter and it produces seeds at the end of the winter, used as vegetable, and its seeds are used for extracting oil. You must have used mustard oil at your homes for different purposes. The organs of the body can be divided into two groups on the basis of their functions. As you know that mustard plant is a plant, and you have observed all the plants in your surrounding, that the plants have roots, they have leaves. So similarly, if mustard plant is there around you and you visit a field of a mustard plant, you're going to observe that the mustard plant also has these characteristics. One is the reproductive part, and that has flowers, because flowers are responsible for pollination. They attract the different insects for the purpose of pollination. And then we have the other part of the plant, and that is the vegetative part. And the vegetative part includes the root, stem, and leaves. And you are also familiar with the function of the leaves, that leaves are responsible for photosynthesis. You can see this mustard oil, which is used at your homes. And then we have this whole plant, mustard plant diagram over here, and it is representing the flower portion and the vegetative part of the plant, and the leaves, the buds, stem, and the roots. And you also know that the roots basically help the plant in absorbing the water from the soil so that it can be utilized in the process of photosynthesis, and the plant can survive. The plant can prepare the food not only for themselves but also for the other organisms who are dependent. So plants basically are the kind of organism which are converting the solar energy into the chemical energy with the help of these tiny factories known as the leaves inside them. Now on the next slide, you can see this frog. Again, one of the multicellular organism. We are going to discuss some of the characteristics of the frog. We discussed that different species of the frog are present on this planet Earth. We are discussing one of the species, and that is Rana tigrina. This is how the Rana tigrina, or of this kind of frog, or this species of the frog looks like. You will find different varieties of the species of the frog around you, but this one is known as Rana tigrina. The body is made up of organ system. As we have discussed that multicellular organisms, they have specialized cells. The cells specialized into tissues, and then tissue specializes into organs and organ system, and the whole organism is formed. So the body of this frog is made up of the different kinds of organ systems like circulatory system, breathing system, excretory system, nervous system. So if all these systems are present, each organ system will be consisting of the different kinds of organs. For example, the excretory system will have the kidneys as organs. Circulatory system will consist of heart. Then the breathing system will have the lungs. So all these things will be observed in the frog. All organs are made up of related tissues. Now you can also relate that why frog is categorized into the category animals, as humans are also included in the animal kingdom. So you can see that the organ systems which I have discussed, which I have named, they are quite similar in human beings as well, like organ systems including the circulatory system, the digestive system. So all organs are made up of the related tissues. Now look at the names of the tissues. Although we are going to discuss the functions of the tissues, the structure and location of the tissues in our chapter that will be related to cell biology. So one of the tissues is the epithelial tissue, which is forming the skin or the body of the organism to the line inside the body of the organism, the line outside of the body of the organism. Then we have these glandular tissues. The glandular tissues basically are responsible for secreting different kinds of secretions of the organisms. Different kinds of secretions are produced which help in the process of digestion. Then we have muscular tissues and the nervous tissues, which will be the part of the different organs and the organ system. So these are the four types of the tissues which are forming the organs, and the different organs will then organize themselves into organ system. So you can see the similarity in the different levels of the frog, and they are same as in the human being. That is why the frog is taken as a dissection material in higher classes, so that the systems which are present inside the frog, they can be studied properly and they can be related to the human beings. Yes, students, let's have an overview of whatever we have studied today. So yes, we discussed about cellular organization. We started with the definition of the cellular organization, and then we discussed the classification of the organisms on the basis of the cell. We have seen the different kinds of the prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and then how the eukaryotic cells were further divided into the unicellular and multicellular organisms. And today we also discussed another category, and that was the colonial organisms. So these three categories were studied in detail along with the examples. You have seen the different kinds of organisms. They are like unicellular organisms, how they were moving, amoebas, parameciums, and euglena. Similarly, the multicellular and colonial organisms. You observed the colonial organism wall box and how it was moving in the aquatic habitat. We discussed about the five major group of organisms, including the plants, animals, prokaryotes, fungi, and protists. So those were the five major group of organisms. We will study the details of those five major group of organisms in our next chapters. So these were the categories which we discussed along with the examples. And so I hope you are familiar with the unicellular organisms, the multicellular organisms, the colonial organisms. Let's repeat again that uni means one, so only one cell makes the body of organisms. Multi means many, so many cells make up the body of the organism. And colonial, as the name indicates, that the organisms are living in the form of a colony. So we discussed the different examples of these categories, and this is how the scientists categorize the organisms. And we have been discussing this again and again, that why it is important to categorize the organisms. Then we discussed about the characteristics of the mustard plant and the frog. And we also came across with the scientific names given by the scientists. So we are going to discuss the scientific names in the chapter biodiversity, that why scientific names are given to the organisms, what is the importance of giving the organisms the scientific name. So I hope the topic which we started today, that was related to cellular organization, was clear to you. go through all the slides again, and if you want, um, and if you find any difficulty in any of the slide, I'll share the video, and you can simply just pause the video wherever you want to, and you can focus on the slide which you think you are not able to understand. Go through these topics again and again so that you may come up with more questions, that how these organisms behave, what are the different criteria to categorize them. So students, thank you so much for your participation. We'll start the new chapter, biodiversity, in tomorrow's class. Allah Hafiz. Thank you so much, class.